My name is Natasha Yacoub. I'm a refugee law scholar and practitioner. I've worked in Egypt, Sudan, Myanmar, and Australia, New Zealand, and 14 Pacific Island states. I'm very much looking forward to discussing these two books with the authors. And before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Kaurna people. They're the traditional custodians of the Adelaide Plains. And I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. I think it's really important to acknowledge the custodians of the land, the traditional owners, in this session especially because of the links to Australia's treatment of its Indigenous population and refugees. And these are some of the issues that come out very strongly, I think, in the books today. So I'd like to introduce the authors. We have Abbas Nazari. In 2001, Abbas and his family fled Afghanistan as refugees and ended up on a small fishing boat in the Indian Ocean. As their boat started to sink, they were rescued by the cargo ship, the Tampa. In what became known as the Tampa Affair, the rescued asylum seekers were denied entry into Australia. Eventually, Abbas and his family were granted asylum to New Zealand, and they're now proud Afghan Kiwis. In 2019, Abbas was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to the United States, where he graduated with a Master's in Security Studies from Georgetown University, Washington, DC. His memoir, After the Tampa, From Afghanistan to New Zealand, is a #1 bestseller, and he has recently been named for a finalist for the 2022 Young New Zealander of the Year. So good. And the second author is Jaivet Ealom. In 2013, Jaivet fled Myanmar's brutal regime, where Rohingya like him were being persecuted and killed in what the International Criminal Court is trying as genocide. He boarded a boat of asylum seekers bound for Australia, where he sought protection. Instead of finding refuge, he was transported to Australia's infamous Manus Island Regional Detention Centre. Blistering hot days spent in shipping containers on the island melted into weeks, then years, until finally, after facing jail in Papua New Guinea or being returned to almost certain death in Myanmar, he took matters into his own hands, drawing inspiration from the hit show Prison Break. I can tell you it's better than Prison Break, by the way. But drawing inspiration from Prison Break, Jaivet meticulously planned his escape. He made it out alive, but was stateless, with no ID and no passport. While the nightmare of Manus was behind him, his true escape to freedom had only just begun. How Jaivet made it to sanctuary in Canada in a 6-month-long odyssey by foot, boat, car and plane, with nothing but his instinct for survival, is miraculous. It also makes for great reading. And as he makes his way through 7 countries and 3 continents, his story will astonish, anger, and inspire you. It will make you reassess what it means to give refugee status and redefine what can be achieved by one man determined to beat the odds. So I'd like to start then with providing the...
...lives in Australia. If you are found not to be a refugee, you will remain in this camp until you decide to go home. It was bleak and demoralizing, and a reminder of who was the boss. We might have been under the legal jurisdictions of Papua New Guinea, according to the deal made by the previous administration in Australia, but since coming to power, Morrison and others in the Abbott government had made it clear offshore processing was now their policy, and they were pulling all the strings. If you choose not to go home, then you will spend a very, very long time here, Morrison told us numerous times a day with a face as impassive and inescapable as the modern-day Big Brother. Thank you.
Thanks, Jaivet. And I think from those passages you get a sense of how much rich information there is in both of these books. Unpack some of the issues with both of you. I'll ask you each questions in turn. First, Abbas, in the first part of your book, you describe the general gradual encroachment of the Taliban forces into your little village, a beautiful but increasingly dangerous place to be. And then as you see the people leaving household by household, your dad was faced with the difficult decision to whether or not to move your family. For all of us who can't really imagine what it's like to take a decision like that, I'm just wondering if you can talk to us about that, explain that.
Sure thing. That's a fantastic starting point. And before I begin, I also wanted to acknowledge that there's a huge Afghan Australian community right in Adelaide. And I know a few friends of mine might be in the audience, might be live streaming, so I just want to give you guys a shout out. Hey, look, that word decision is so both incredibly appropriate and inappropriate at the same time. And the reason is that in so many instances, you have the choices is made for you. There are forces outside of your control, which in my case was the encroachment and the forever growth of the Taliban at the time. Putting it to today in 2022, I mean, you look at the Ukrainian situation, those people don't have a choice whether they want to stay in Kiev or other places. The choice is made for them because bombs are falling around them. And in my case, the Taliban had seized the villages around ours, and we could either stay and become cannon fodder or become, prisoners or at the very least, at least kicked off our lands at the hands of the Taliban, or we could leave. And that was it. The choice was made. We didn't want to leave. We'd lived on those lands for generations. It was passed down from generation to generation. And so I found it very hard to get that point across, that a lot of people see people on the move and they think, well, mate, they've decided to leave their country. They've decided to seek shelter elsewhere. But there are so many steps in the lead up to that people miss, that we don't want to leave, that this is our farmland, this is where I've grown up, this is where my friends are, this is where my sense of community is. And now for forces outside of our control, we have to go. And so that was a decision that we faced all the way back in 2001. And sadly, we see time and time again with many other communities.
Absolutely. Thanks for making that really important distinction. And it goes then to the question of whether people are arriving illegally or not. And it's obviously not illegal to seek asylum under international law. So, and to the reading that Jaivet did. Jaivet, did you want to comment on that as well, or?
Yeah, I think it is really important to that point to echo Abbas, like the choice. I think people who had never to leave or who had never to abandon everything they had might never realize this. But when, if we look at it with from an analogy of, like, let's say a snake is chasing you and you don't necessarily decide where to go. You take the chance you have, whatever it is, you don't care. You just take the best possible survival, the best possible chance that offer the survival for you. And in that case, in the case of Australia, like you arrived, we were even told at points on Manus, like during one of interview or information sessions that they like to call, we never send out invitation letters or anything. But when you're running from a snake, you don't care if it is a private property or there is no trespassing sign. You just jump over the fence, whichever has the highest survival chance of it. And I think that's really important. That choice was never made like a conscious decision. It's almost like your unconscious brain like driving you at that point. And also leaving home, I think that's also another very important point, that I feel like leaving home is like not just the house or the home in physical form. You're abandoning everything you have known at that point. And I think I have never met a single person yet to this day who loved to left to abandon their home.
That's right. Thanks, Jaivet. I think that comes out really powerfully in both of your books. And I think another point, so a question to you, Jaivet, another point that comes out very powerfully, I think, in your book is the comparison of your treatment at the hands of the Australian government and your treatment by the Myanmar government. So there are comparisons all the way through. So about dehumanization, not using names, giving a number. You were EML 019. You didn't have a name, and then comparing that with what had happened in Myanmar, and how language matters and words have consequences, life-destroying consequences. And I have to say that really struck me. It really struck a chord with me, having worked in your hometown in Mongdor and in Rakhine State, and then having moved with the UN to work in Manus and on Manus and Nauru. The comparisons were very evident to me as well, just about dehumanizing acts and language and the importance of language, and how language, the short path from harmful language to violence, acts of violence. So I just wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Thank you for bringing that up. I think the language matters a lot, especially the way it is being, especially if it is being set or put up by official governments or official state. This is oftentimes, or in the case of Manus in Australia, it was most of the time, by the time the truth actually made to outside, like that, the lies that have been put out there reach everywhere, and there is like no damage controls or anything. For one of the example was like when the prisons was attacked, there was like official statements of saying it was the detainees who were trying to escape, but the reality was the other way around. Everybody came into the centers and attacked. But that truth, even after finding of like numerous investigations, never corrected. And like to the eyes of the public, to the eyes of Australian, there's always detainees, illegal arrivals, escapees, violence. Like this might not matter a lot if you look at individually, but if you look at like consistent over the time, you would see like this a picture starting to emerge out of it. And while on Manus, this, given the time, it might be unfair for me to just say one or two examples, and I hope you will be convinced to compare a dictator, an authoritarian regime in Burma with Australia. But if you look all the details, the similarities were striking, like the removal of individuality on Manus Island, taking people's name off and giving them a number, and using several tactics that which I never hoped that I will see in a country or in a democratic country like this. Divide and conquer, like setting up detainees against each other. I can go on and go on, but it is very similar, and it shocked me at some point. But the difference is in Burma or in any other authoritarian regime, like if they do bad things and they abuse the residents or the citizens, it's often visible or often make it to the media that way. In the case of Manus, in the case of Australia, it was often rebranded, with a little bit of rhetorics and sugar-coated words, and labeled as common sense, to be honest, labeled as like protecting the borders, saving lives, while punishing those who just made that sea. So there is a difference, but in Australian one, it is, I guess, it went through a process of like media process of putting out there. By the end, it was being sold as common sense to the Australian public.
Thanks, Jaivet. I think that's part of the reason why I saw your book is so important, because it's filled with so many facts and incredible detail and accurate details of what goes on in the Manus Island Detention Centre, and in a way it sort of redresses the balance and why it makes it so important to read. Abbas, I think you also have a lot of important detail, and you address similar issues about language in your book. Did you want to comment a little bit on what Jaivet has said?
Yeah, I think I always find it, never lost on me the fact that at the time of the Tampa affair, there was not one person, one photograph, one name, or one key identifier of us while we were being, held on the Tampa. All you had was that really iconic photo taken from Christmas Island of the big red container ship out there in the ocean, and not one photo or one name or one quote or anything attributed to us. So in many cases, it was almost like, even though we're out there in the Indian Ocean, we might as well have been on another planet, because we were that cut off. Everything that was being said about us was without us, essentially. And now it's never lost on me that here I am writing a book, telling the story for the first time from mine and so many others' perspectives. So my point here is that it's not only the type of words and the type of rhetoric and language that is used. In many instances, the entirety of the story is never revealed or never allowed to be told to listeners. And for me to finally have the chance to tell the story, and the incredibly warm reception it's received from both sides of the ditch, it's been fantastic and incredibly humbling experience.
Yeah, and thank you for telling those stories. I think one of the really striking points that comes out in both of the books is the fact that before someone gets onto a boat, they've shown incredible strength and courage and resilience already to even get there, to survive the boat journey, and then to seek protection. And then it becomes very clear, what it is that they're in need of that's sorely lacking in the response of Australia. So, really important stories to tell. Thank you. So from Abbas, you tell from a real childlike perspective what it was like fleeing. You talk about how you got to Quetta, and when you arrived there, you had a banana for the first time. You saw a banana and a mango for the first time, and you didn't know what to do with the banana, so you ate it with the skin on. And then you went through to onto the boat, and you onto a plane first, for the very first time in an airport from your little village, first time on a plane, so you felt like you were in the belly of a giant bird, you said. And then you get, of course, to the Palapa, the boat that was to take you to Australia. And you said it was, I think, like a dying donkey, it was really, that had been whipped to its last breath. It was really just quite unseaworthy. So you're describing it very much from this childlike perspective. But then, after miraculously surviving a storm on that boat, you were rescued by the Norwegian commercial ship, the MV Tampa, that was fulfilling its duty under international law of the sea to rescue you and take you to the nearest port, which was Australia. And then you were stopped by the Australian government for docking. And then you said in the days that followed, you aged far beyond your years. Can you describe what you mean by that?
Yeah, the entire journey from, jumping in the back of a lorry all the way in day one when we left our little village in the central highlands of Afghanistan, to being in a refugee camp in Pakistan, to living place to place, street to street in Jakarta, Indonesia, to finally being rescued. That entire journey was, to me, in the eyes of 8-year-old Abbas, was just one giant, awesome adventure. I had no context, no understanding, no real greater understanding of why we were doing what we were doing. I could understand the physical environment, and that was it. And then when we went through the storm, which was the experience or the episode that is etched into my memory in high definition, and I'll remember it to my dying day. When we went to the storm and then we get rescued by this boat, this giant, red metal wall that appears out of the horizon. The experience of being both the storm itself, the couple of days that we spent on that fishing boat, and then the days and then often weeks that we would spend out at sea while the Tampa Affair was playing out, that had such a profound impact on me and the 400 others who were rescued for so many reasons. We had come as close to death as you can imagine. And then we were rescued. Again, the sense of jubilation was out of this world. It was like an out-of-body experience. And then for that relation to just suddenly come crashing down and be this elongated, this painful days that would turn into weeks out there in the Pacific Ocean, in the equatorial heat out there in the Indian Ocean. It was just this. It was very hard to describe that massive shift of mood. And so even though we spent a total of, I think, 5 weeks at sea during the entire Tampa saga, it could have easily been 5 years, because that's how much emotion we went through in that time. So we aged, obviously, physically because of the impact of being out there and sleeping in a container and using plastic bags and buckets full of latrines. But also mentally and emotionally, it had a massive, massive toll. Thankfully, ironically so, looking back at it, I'm so thankful that I was a little kid throughout that, because my age meant that perhaps I am shielded away from some of the mental trauma that someone who is a bit older, who had a greater understanding of the experience, they would have to carry that for far, far longer than I did. So I find that as a bit of a silver lining.
Thanks, Abbas. That really comes out, I think, strongly in the book as well, that you write your story, but also on behalf of others whose path was quite different. Jaivet, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think Abbas just hit it in the nail when there was a point in Manus where I wish I never understood English. I wish I never spoke English, because the more you're able to understand, the more you're observant, the more you suffer. Because like people who don't understand might be able, who don't understand English, at least with all of those Australian accents that are coming from so fast at that time, would not have to put up with the mockery of like the guards making joke out of you. Like they wouldn't have to put it up with it. But the more you understand, the more observant you are, and the more you suffer, essentially. And I think that's one of the very key point there, like having a different times of age over there. And the other point also was the time expand itself, like in the way of, I can't even, I think, word would do justice, like if I were to describe how time expand. And the cherry on the top in the case of Australian detention was like we never had a date, like we never had a sentence to say, so to speak, like, and of which I guess even the worst of the worst criminal could expect. We didn't have a date to come to. We didn't know if or when we will get out. So it was like this torture, like mental and psychological torture, was following you 24/7. It's not like physical torture where once they stop kicking you, the pain stops. It doesn't. It's follow you 24/7. It won't let you sleep. It doesn't let you rest. It doesn't let you like think. It's like constantly there. So, and I think that take a huge mental toll, and how the time is being perceived at that times. And you would often hear from the guys on Manus, like the time and having, especially on Manus, where we were cut off from the civilizations, like for the first 3 years, you would do like random stuff that won't make sense in the outside world. Like there was one time where a friend of mine was saying like, "Oh, did you count those nails on the roof?" And the joke was like, "No, I actually name each of them." not just count them. So like there's a lot of things that when toppling the times upside down do to human brain and stretch that so much.
Yeah. I think, thanks, Abbas. Thanks, Jaivet. I think one of the incredible aspects of your book that I found most surprising is how well you were able to capture some of those experiences for people like us. And it's, you know, not just the cruelty, I think, and when you're talking about mental suffering, that has been documented very much with Manus and Nauru and the concepts of, you know, limbo, being in limbo and indefinite detention and all of those breaches of fundamental human rights, and that then have such dire consequences on the individuals that are subject to them. And, you know, Australia's been referred, I think, 6 times to the International Criminal Court for its conduct in offshore processing. So it was quite incredible then that you were able to really transport the reader there and really explain that cruelty in human terms. But it's not all doom and gloom. Your book also has incredibly beautiful stories of human compassion and kindness. Yeah, as much as some of the scenes from Myanmar and from Manus Island had me in tears of frustration or anger, so too did some of the beautiful stories of kindness and friendship of strangers have me in tears as well. So, you know, at the point when you were leaving the Solomon Islands, you know, there was a woman, Rindy, who had helped you. In fact, she'd gone to great risk to herself, I think, so gone above and beyond to help you. And I think you were saying when you left her, how can I repay you? And she said, you know, in Solomon Islands culture, there is no debt among friends, which had me in tears. But without making the audience cry, could you please elaborate a little bit on some of the themes of kindness and compassion that you elaborate on in the book?
Sure. Since I'm talking to most of you guys in there in Australia, I think like I would make the case of the very first helper was an Australian woman, and this was at a time when I think it's fair to say like I lost faith in humanity. Like I was so bitter, salty, like and all of that. You know what? Everywhere I turn, I see an Australian guards or I see Australian governments poking me from left to right and right to left. Like so, I had like very little to no hope. And then like there was this woman who essentially was taking huge legals and professional risks on her own for someone who never met her, essentially a stranger. And then like that was the first time that I think a single individual helped me to restore faith in humanity. And it was quite important at the time because on one side it was Australian governments and all these Australian guards. On the other side it was the same Australian woman who was helping me. And you can see like I had a hard time like to take both of them in the process. So, and it continued. There was also people actually in the system, working for the detentions and working in the governments, yet doesn't necessarily agree with what is going on, and then like they feel helpless, like against such giant systems, and they took risks to help yet someone who they never met, they will never met in the futures, and they barely know my full story, and yet took such great risks like to help someone get out. And it often made me think the most impactful act of helping were like those who never expect anything in returns and then like just help to move the humanity forward. And I had even though I can, you know, put out their names out there for being fears of repercussions, I think I would have never made it without their helps. So in that case, I always like to say, doesn't matter how much resilience or how hardworking a person is, it always take another person who is probably on the more privileged end of that spectrums to put this kindness to make that into fully blooms to someone. So it's kind of like this dispositions between the two, like taking the kindness and giving the kindness. And it is often, in my case, happen to be strangers.
Incredible. You know, I have to say that you were the only person to escape from Manus Island detention, and the story of moving from Pacific Island state to Pacific, how you did that is nothing short of incredible and much better than any episode of Prison Break, I have to say. It took a lot of strength and courage and planning from your side, but you really do weave in the stories of strangers and how each time there was a stumbling block, you would meet someone who would then facilitate the rest of the journey. Yeah, it was very compelling reading, I found. I couldn't put it down. It just turning the pages to work out what was going to happen next. It was really, had me on the edge of my seat. But, you know, it was also good, I thought, in the sense that it doesn't show refugee issues as they're often portrayed as polarized, so black and white, bad, you know, good and evil, or just, there were no binaries. You sort of moved away from that, and you showed some of the nuance and complexities of the situation and human experience as you were leaving. And that's something, Abbas, that you do as well and you touch on at the end of your book, which I also found to be an absolute page-turner and read in one go, I think. Because, you know, at the end when you're reflecting on the polarised refugee issues, but then more broadly about racism that you had said you'd never experienced in New Zealand, and then, you know, the Christchurch massacre happened, and then, you know, you're also reflecting on what had happened in Afghanistan, your home country, and then tying it all in to your experiences. You make really very profound statements in the last chapter about how to move beyond that polarised debate and change, I think, the narratives, the discourse with more sort of empathetic approaches and taking into account multiple perspectives. So can you just elaborate for us on how you think, you know, especially there's an election coming up here, and the issues of the policies are the same as they were, you know, if not more hard than they were 20 years ago. So how do we move beyond this? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh man, you know, here I am in little old New Zealand looking at what's happening across the ditch in Australia. Obviously a big year for you guys with an election looming. And the one thing that I always get from readers of my book is that it's given them a sense of perspective on refugee issues. It's given a sense of perspective on what's happening in Afghanistan, why that country is the way that it is. So that word, that's it, perspective. And if we are able to just, what I say, you know, sometimes zoom out of an issue, sometimes we get lost in the nitty gritty. We zoom so far into the day-to-day, the minute by minute, that we actually lose sense of the bigger picture. And all that nuance is lost, and everything becomes black and white, when in fact the world is not black and white. So my key point here, and I'll share two very quick stories from the book. You know, I grew up in Christchurch in Canterbury. That's, even though I'm based in Wellington now here working, you know, Christchurch will always be home. Big fan of the Crusaders rugby team, which tends to dominate every Australian rugby team there. Sorry, guys. And the Christchurch, obviously, the Christchurch mosque shootings happened. I was just down the road when it happened. You know, there's a chapter in the book called A Dark Day in the Garden City, and it's probably one of the hardest chapters for me to write about. And the reason that is obviously just the sheer terror that you know, a man from Grafton, New South Wales, you know, unleashed on our beautiful little city. But in amongst that, the Afghan community rallied around, and we were trying to pick up the pieces afterwards. And we're always trying to see, what the hell do we make of this? Is this the New Zealand that we know and love? Is this the New Zealand that has been so good to us? And one elder stood up in the community and he said, look, when we first arrived off the Tampa and we arrived at Auckland Airport, they closed the curtains on the bus that was going to take us from the airport into the Mangere Refugee Resettlement Centre. And everyone said, why would you close the curtains? You know, we arrived in a new country, we want to see what's out there. And the reason was that they'd heard that heard some intel that there might be protesters on the way who might be against us arriving to New Zealand. Keep in mind, this was 3 weeks after 9/11. And yet, on the way to the refugee resettlement center, there wasn't any protest. There was one man holding a miserable little sign. And we were welcomed into the refugee center with the most amount of food I had ever seen in my life. and so the perspective is so key. That's the key point there. Do we choose to remember the actions of one guy with a miserable sign, or do we choose to remember the incredible welcome that we were given on that first day in New Zealand? And I think when it comes to policy, refugee and immigration policy, be it here in Australia, be it here in New Zealand or there in Australia, that's so key to, that's so important to maintain. And that's why I think my book and my story and Jaivet's book has resonated with readers, that it gives you a sense of perspective of, some of the real problems out there, but also in amongst that black and white, there's a hell of a lot of grey.
Yeah. I agree. Jaivet, do you want to add anything to that, or?
Maybe just quickly touch on your points of black and white, which is not so much gray. I think part of the reason that people rarely get to talk to or much so less about reading of people who actually experiences through. So whenever there's a story of whether it's refugees or war, by the time it made to publish publish book or publish articles, it go through numerous publishing filters, and by the time it managed to reach out there, it barely contains the original, all the nuance and all the details of it. And I think it's only by either talking to someone's or readings or other who went through that you realize. And I had this not joke but actual experience like my first landlord when I was renting in an apartment in Waterloo was probably the harshest old grumpy man that I've ever seen. He was constantly giving me a hard time, and part of the reason was his circles were mostly whites and whatnot. He was a big Trump supporter and yada yada. But at the end, when I was leaving, and he was offering me essentially to stay rent free, and then saying, "Oh no, I gotta go," and he was just come back whenever you need. You're the nicest brown persons I've ever met, and I'm also the first brown person who actually lived with him. So I think it is important to get that great nuance that often doesn't make past the publishing filter to actually understand what is behind the scene.
Yeah, I agree. Just on that point, I mean, Jaivet, your experience after arriving in Canada was markedly different from the experience you had when you sought protection from Australia. I wonder if you could, and of course we here often think about Canada as an example of good practice and in many ways in asylum. And I just wonder if you could let us know a little bit about how you were received and whether Canada really is, how we perceive it to be from here, from Australia.
Yeah, sure. And thank you. I think that's a very important comparison, which I often make without consciously thinking about it. My first welcoming on Christmas Island, JT, on that day, on that July sunny morning, was a formal strip search all the way to, all the way to naked and on. And that's so after 4 years and 4.5 years on Manus, seeing all these hardened uniforms, I was mentally and physically prepared when I was arriving at Toronto Pearson Airport. And there was this immigration officer who said the default protocol is for him to go through the interview, and then but I didn't have any food for the last 3 nights and days, so I was my stomach was built up in acid, and I was having a hard time. And then he said he left the room So I was expecting, for him to arrive with a bunch of more immigration officers, like the way it happened on Manus oftentimes. 2 guards on each side, and I barely have to walk. They will just like raise you and drag you to the planes. I was waiting for him to arrive with more officers, obviously. But then he arrived with a Subway sandwich and said, I can't interview someone who is pain and hungry. The kitchen is closed because it is past 2 a.m. in the morning. So he went out and bought a Subway sandwich with his own money. And after 4 years on Manus, I wasn't expecting that, not at least from a uniform officers. So that was like the first lessons right at the airport. And then it continues somehow, but in the bigger picture was in Australia, I think the same amount of money, billions of dollars, if not like less than Canada, was being used to exclude like this very a specific cohort of peoples. And at the same time I see the same, if not much, was being used for inclusions on purpose in Canada. And at the end the difference were the results were, one is like at a cost of like staining the history, and the great moral cost and the big human suffering that that resulted from those exclusions. And in Canadian side, you can see like you could read the text and you got skilled laborers and you got educated peoples without anything. I said like it's oftentimes I was being told a few times when I was on Manus, like there was this arguments of Centrelink, which I believe is the welfare agency, that like peoples will suck on the Centrelinks or whatnot. But at the same time, if you're afraid of inclusion costing money, but the exclusion was actually costing almost double that money. Like it was billions of dollars on Manus. And look at Canada. Like there was inclusions policy on purpose. With the same money, you get much more achieved, not just cruelty. So I think that's the blanket arguments, or like the overall overarching themes that I come to realize like over the last few years in my time here.
Thanks, Jaivet. And I think that's what the book makes very, very clear, I think, as well, is just a big question mark about those punitive policies and why that level of cruelty is necessary, or how unnecessary it is, to be more precise. And also, both of you, I think, through your contrasting experiences with both Canada and New Zealand, then draw out the difference between a policy that's driven by security and punitive measures versus a policy that's driven by protection and care. And they're not mutually exclusive, obviously, but there's one approach really overrides the other, and in both instances. So I just wonder if you wanted to quickly touch on that as well, Abbas, because it obviously comes out for the second half of your book.
Yeah, look, first and foremost, obviously I'm speaking to an Australian audience. I don't want to keep bashing Aussies for being, bad rugby players and compassionate and all the rest of it, all right? I've got plenty of Aussie mates, and hoping when border restrictions are lifted, I'll come out over there and do an Aussie book tour.
Yeah.
But, look, I've got plenty of friends over there, and the point I want to make, the point I want to make is this, that there are many different ways of doing something, and whether, we should all have strong border protection or immigration rules, whatever you want to call it. But I think it's abundantly clear to myself, having been on the other side of it, to analysts outside of Australia and folks like yourself within Australia, that perhaps it's gone beyond just border protection and just become plainly inhumane. It's financially unfeasible. We all know that. It's your taxpayer dollars that are paying for it. And then, in my book, I say, when this dark chapter in Australian history is closed and perhaps a future government will do a Royal Commission of Inquiry into it, I think many of the architects will long be gone by then, and hopefully there might be a moment of reflection on the fact that this policy has led to the deaths and suicides of so many people who just came out in search of a better life. So that's my view on it. And then a lot of people say, well, if you were in a room with John Howard, what would you say to him? And, say, I have a hell of a lot to say to John Howard, but the reality of it is this. It's that little old New Zealand gave us a chance to live out our lives, and everything that I ever needed to say to that government has been said in the way we have lived and most importantly thrived right here in New Zealand. And if you look at the refugee populations around the world, all they need is just those three things: a bit of security, a bit of dignity, and a bit of agency, and that's they can get on with living. And sadly, when I look at Australia's policy, they are stripped of those three things. They have no security, they have no dignity, and they're stripped of all agency. And it's very sad to watch. And I'm so thankful there are folks like yourselves out there who care, who give a damn, and who are willing to lobby and send an email to your local MP to say, hey, what are you doing about this?
All right, I think I could probably keep you guys in conversation all day and all night, but I won't. I just wondered if there was a final point that you wanted people to take from your books. First, Jaivet, then Abbas. Jaivet first.
Sure. Thank you. If I were to have a message that I can give to you guys all, is just ask for like I can clearly see at a time in future there will be a moment of reckonings and saying sorry to these peoples who all suffered as a consequences of policies that the government put up. But a lot of things were done, I think it's fair to say, under your name with your tax money, and I think it is important for you to claim that and like not to let your name stains in the bigger pictures. From looking from across halfway across the world, a lot of people often say, "Oh, the Australians are doing it. The Australians are doing it." Like it doesn't distinguish oftentimes like the Australian public as the Australian governments. It's a democracy, it's elected governments, and it's essentially under your name. Your money, and I think it is important for you to know what is being done under your name with your money.
Absolutely. Thanks. And Abbas, your final word?
First, I want to thank you all for coming out today and actually caring and choosing to reflect. August 2021 was the 20th anniversary of the Tampa affair. And that's why my book came out in August last year, to mark that occasion. And so thank you all for coming out today. Look, my key point that I want to pass to folks within the audience and people tuning in right now across Australia, but most importantly, to those who wince at the thought of talking about refugees, who shy away or who turn away vehemently when you want to bring up this topic, who have very strong opinions on it, those are the people that I tried to engage with in this book. I wanted this to be picked up by someone who wanted the borders to be even stronger than Howard built them. I want to be able to engage with those people and say, hey man, the threat, the imagery, the narrative that you have been fed about these people coming to threaten your way of life, to take your jobs, this and that, it's all false. And all you have to do is look around the refugee populations throughout Australian and global history and their additions and that they have made to their contributions that they've made to their communities. I'm so proud of the Tampa community, because off the back of that, we have a thriving Afghan Kiwi population. And I know there are a hell of a lot of Afghan Australians watching today, and they're in all sorts of fields, students, nurses, police officers, people in all sorts of trades and all that. And they're just part and parcel of Australian, New Zealand, Canadian public life. They're just they've woven themselves into the fabric of daily society. And I would say that those who have been prevented that ideal, those who have been locked up because they want to be part of that fabric, sadly, they will be scarred mentally and emotionally for the rest of their lives. And it's a stain on Australia's reputation.
Thank you so much. So let me finish then where we started, and that was with acknowledgement of country, and linking back to one of the passages from Jaivet's book, actually, a theme that comes out as well in Abbas' book, and it's the link to colonialism. Jaivet says, hatred, xenophobia, militarism, and the spirit of conquest has deep roots on the island and in Australian culture. Back in the days when the white settlers cleared the territory for themselves, their efforts set off a long chain of events that resulted in some Indigenous people being sent to missions and other institutions to get them out of the way. So to the extent that refugee issues have been put elsewhere, to the extent that they've been hidden from view, that people have been put on offshore processing detention centres, and media has found it difficult to report, or that people who work there have had sanctions against them for speaking out, to the extent that they have been kept in the shadows or in the dark, these books offer some light. And as both of these incredible authors have spoken to you about today, it's really important to hear and understand their stories. They've spoken, they've shared their stories with you, and I do think it's our responsibility as Australians to read it. So there are copies available in the bookstore over there. Thank you for your time, thanks for your interest, and mostly thank you to our two brilliant authors who shared their stories.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Thank you.